All right, folks, happy Thursday. I hope that this finds you well and that your week is going along nicely. I want to continue from our discussion on Tuesday with a couple of, again, just kind of like building on the history of alcohol, and in particular, furthering more of the kind of evolutionary history with alcohol, because I think that's rather quite fascinating and in particular, really worthwhile of potentially considering. And so in that regard, we are going to be in handling the hard stuff, and we're going to start on page 6. Okay, and in particular, this is again just an overview of sorts of just kind of like unpacking, perhaps going back to like our discussion on Tuesday of what the Nat Geo article said. This continuing with kind of the thought that that maybe we've been pre-adapted, right? Given our adaptations evolutionarily, pre-adapted to prefer the taste of alcohol. Okay. All right. So this starts with the following. This is by Jonathan Silvertown. All right. Alcohol has bound us in knots with sinews that run deep. The reason that it is such a hold on us for good as well as ill is that ethanol is a toxin for which we have evolved a tolerance. So again, this idea that ethanol is not like, it's not. As this says here, it's a toxin, right? It's a toxin, and in thinking about it being and holding toxicity, well, why do we consume it if it's a toxin, right? We don't actively put other toxins in our body, do we? Most generally no. It depends on maybe the level of toxin or toxicity, right? Alcohol is different in this respect from other mind-altering drugs. Opium, cannabis, and cocaine exert their effects upon the brain by mimicking natural substances in the nervous system. The plants that produce opiates, cannabinoids, and cocaine have evolved these psychoactive compounds as weapons in their arms race with herbivores. These substances only happen to affect us because brain chemistry is similarly across the animal kingdom. A heroin addict is a bystander casualty of the war between poppies and caterpillars. I don't fully understand what's happening in that paragraph other than the idea that some psychoactive properties that maintain in those substances we find in ourselves, and again, there's kind of the ignition, right? By contrast, however, ethanol is a toxin with no functional equivalent in human metabolism, right? And so that's one reason why we get hangovers. That's one reason why sometimes it's really hard to ingest alcohol, is for the fact that our metabolism isn't totally up to speed for doing that, especially high quantities. Ethanol is a toxin with no functional equivalent in human metabolism. This is also true of poisons like something arsenic, but if ethanol were purely a toxin, then wine, beer, and spirits would be obscure concoctions confined to the poisons cabinet of the pharmacy. The difference between the ethanol and the other poisons is that we have been exposed to ethanol in our food for a very long time because the signature dish of the great apes is the fruit cocktail. Fruit is the mainstay of the chimpanzee diet and must also have been important in the diet of common ancestors that we shared with them more than 5 million years ago. Where there is ripe fruit, there is yeast, and where there is yeast, there will be alcohol. And then this line's pretty funny. We are grape apes as much as great apes. Get it? Grape apes. Great apes. Okay. Kind of funny. But again, kind of like really kind of, again, honing in on this ideology, on this thought that perhaps it's not that we just like to get drunk, right? Perhaps it's not just that we like the taste or the effect of alcohol, but rather, again, kind of like deeply ingrained into our evolutionary fiber, there might be the proclivity of fermenting fruit. There might be the proclivity for the taste of fermenting fruit, right? The bloom upon ripening grape contains films, microbes, yada, 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 yada. I'm going to skip down a couple paragraphs. The central role of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, so that's the brand of yeast, right? Cerevisia, coming from Cerevisiae. The evolutionary history of fermented drinks begins not 10,000 years ago, the domestication of the grape or grain, nor 200,000 years ago, with the advent of modern humans, or even 10 million years ago, with the diversification of the great apes, but 125 to 150 million years ago, in the Cretaceous period, when flowering plants bearing fruit emerged. This is when the ancestors of modern brewers' yeast began their career consuming sugar and fruit and evolved the ability to turn it into ethanol in the presence of air, laying the genetic foundations of an epoch-making drinks business and a profitable sideline in bakery. So again, mildly kind of comical ending line there. But it has to be recognized, right, that this notion of the history, right, of we think about yeasts and we think about fermenting fruit, this isn't just 10,000 years in the making. This isn't just 200,000 years in the making, right? This is maybe 125 million years in the making. Like, that's wild, right? Because this line here is that 125 million years ago is when the ancestors of modern brewers' yeast began their career consuming sugar and fruit. Okay? So the process of fermentation has been a natural process within the world for potentially 125 million years. Right? That's wild. Okay? All right. And then the article makes reference to ADH and ADH1, which are genes, and the ability to process enzymes, okay, as it relates to ethanol, as it relates to this yeast that is referenced continuously, Cerevisiae. Okay. The enzyme encoded by the second gene, ADH2, converts ethanol into acid. Some of the chemistry and some of the science here gets me bogged down quite a bit. It gets me, the technical aspect of it gets me kind of bogged down. But nevertheless. On page 8 right now. Okay? And again, just like thinking about just kind of building this conception this week. On page 8, I'm on the second paragraph here. All right. Never often, yada, yada, yada. Our closer relative, the gorilla, on the other hand, carries the same ADH4 mutation that we do, though whether you really want to go drinking with one, I'll leave it to your sober judgment. And kind of funny. But talking about this idea here that fruit with an incidental lacing of alcohol was a staple foodstuff of our primate ancestors. And in this diet lies the origin of our tolerance for ethanol and hence our interest in manufacturing it. That's the main takeaway from this paragraph. This is the second full one, the first full one on page 8. Okay? This hypothesis was, until recently, mere speculation, but given genetic evidence, has now brought it to near fruition. Okay? So again, kind of building off that National Geographic article where saying maybe we were pre-adaptive to being able to ingest and be drawn to fermenting fruit. This is now making the claim, this is making the claim that fruit with an incidental lacing of alcohol was a staple foodstuff of our primate ancestors, and in this diet lies the origin of our tolerance for ethanol. So again, this idea that, again, like if we think evolutionary, where like this is passed to this, and then this is passed to this, and then this is passed to this. Like if that is continuing on the chain, then it's possible that, again, like, I don't think this is all too far-fetched. That's what I'll show my hand here, right? that the linkage here seems pretty clear. Now, does this mean that we should go have a beer every day? Does this mean that we should, that we have to get, hammered every weekend? Absolutely not. But what it does suggest, both our discussion on Tuesday and as we continue with this article today, what it does suggest is that the predisposition, evolutionarily speaking, for alcohol is there, right? Is there. All right, so now I'm in the next paragraph here. The long evolutionary acquaintance among yeast, fruit, and primates must surely mean that when humans learned to cultivate plants, it was a foregone conclusion that fermented drinks would soon result. Indeed, it has often been suggested that the first cereals, and this goes back to our article on Tuesday, were not raised to make bread, but to brew beer. Beer is not only nutritious, right? Like, it is filling. Like, when you have a couple of beers, you feel full. Why do you feel full? It's because you just ingested, what did we decide? What was it? Wheat, barley, grain, and maybe hop, right? Something that is kind of filling. Indeed, it has often been suggested that the first cereals were not raised to make bread, but to brew beer. Beer is not only nutritious, but alcoholic fermentation also controls harmful bacteria that might be present in the water supply. Again, going back to the Nat Geo article, it might be safer to actually drink back then, historically speaking. The earliest direct archaeological evidence of fermented drinks so far discovered comes from residues fermented with rice, honey, and fruit found inside pottery jars from early Neolithic village of HoA in Henan province, China. Again, this 9,000-year-old brew was made either with grapes or hawthorn fruit. Though it is the earliest example we know of, it cannot actually have been the first, even in China. I mean, that's last sentence is pretty speculative, but if we want to go with like what we have objectively, like again going back to our discussion on subjective objective, objectively, right, this idea that 9,000 years ago, that's crazy. It's fairly unfathomable, right? Yeah. All right. And then they kind of like talk more about just kind of the development of this history. They talk about grafting, which means, if I have a grape and I graft off of it, it means that I can kind of develop a new offshoot. Okay, and that's on page 9. They talk about Holy Communion, again playing a historical importance there. Okay. Then they move on to breweries, kind of at the very end here. Now I'm just going to read the last paragraph, right? Alcohol is best enjoyed in a social environment. For there it fosters bonhomie and liberates to free flow of conversation and with what the Irish call criac. We are all wittier on wine, or at least we would like to think. Supply food as well as alcohol, both in liberal quantities, and a mere dinner shall become a feast. Feasting takes our exploration of evolution and food into the social domain. Okay? So again, I don't have and especially in this article and in the next one, it doesn't say that, the first major feast with wine and beer occurred, on this date and this time. But you can go back through, again, the record in various cultures, whatever culture you might be interested in studying, and even going back to that map on Tuesday, right, of thinking about, 3,000, 4,000 BC and up to the present day, right, of how present alcohol, in some form or another, wine, beer, rice wine, beer, rice wine, spirits, right, has been just present alongside humans for 10,000 plus years. And even predating that, our ancestors, right, our evolutionary ancestors. And predating that, yeast, fermenting fruit, 125 million years ago. For me, when I really started thinking about this, it is just kind of mind-boggling. All right. We're going to move to the next article in the next video, and I will keep it much shorter, I promise.